abnormal appearance, Richard retorted. If I may, Joey began. No, you may not, said Richard rudely, rounding on Joey. Butt out, Joey. No, snapped Joey. I'm tired of always being pushed around because I'm one of the youngest. I may be naive about certain things, but I'm not a coward, unlike Frankie. Leave me out of this, Joey, said Frank uneasily. He's right for once, said Richard, rounding on Frank. You are a coward. You're the one who admitted you feel safer with James around, retorted Frank. And if I'm not mistaken, there were times when we went on dangerous hikes back at camp where you became so scared you would literally cling to James while shaking like a leaf. I wasn't the only one with issues. Richard's face turned red with embarrassment. You were the one who always got excited whenever James complimented you. What's the matter? Didn't people ever praise your car-fixing skills back in Utah? Don't you dare start with me, Richard, warned Frank, losing his patience. Or me, Joey added. Shut up, Joey, Frank shouted. And you know what? Jimmy's right. You do eat way too much. Always raiding the canteen store when the counselors weren't looking, every chance you got, added Richard. And I haven't forgotten the time your cousins, Ralphie, Doreen, and Barry visited, and you guys stole an entire crate of chocolate bars for yourself, Carly added angrily. Ugh, they were vomiting all night long, shuddered Christy, remembering. Don't remind me, Dudette, said Gary uneasily. And you know what else is true? Carly suddenly said. You're lazy, Gary. I'm what? You're lazy! As long as James and I have known you, you never took anything seriously. I don't know how you passed your lifeguard test, and I'm pretty sure the only reason you work in that Greek diner is because it's your family's business. That's not fair, Gary cried, shocked. I worked very hard to be a lifeguard at my family's diner. In fact, it was my idea to give you and James free food to last you 2 weeks earlier this year. Which is probably the only time you ever thought of us instead about your hair, your face, your outfits, or anything else that had to do with you impressing every other girl at our high school, yelled Carly relentlessly. How dare you? Gary's voice broke. He sat down on the floor in defeat with his eyes full of tears. As Pedro and Reginald, who had remained silent this whole time, comforted him, the others rounded angrily on Carly. Frank stormed up to her with clenched fists. How dare you treat my best friend that way, Catherine Eleanor Nordberg? Frank raised his fist and tried to punch Carly, but she ducked and he ended up clocking Richard in the face by mistake. Instead of acknowledging it as a mistake, Richard, who was also mad at Frank, lunged at him and the two started wrestling with each other. Carly, who had fallen to the floor while ducking Frank, was helped to her feet by Joey. Instead of thanking Joey, however, Carly tried to smack him, but missed and hit Christy instead. Furious, Christy picked up Carly and punched her by sending her flying into Joey, who toppled over Frank and Richard. Come here, fat boy, Frank yelled. Give me your best shot, retorted Joey. Within seconds, Carly, Richard, Frank, Christy, and Joey were all engaged in a flat-out brawl. I don't even want to describe how disgraceful, how disgusting, how despicable it was to see them going at each other. Meanwhile, in Area 86 security room, General Henderson and several other soldiers were watching our heroes from the cameras. It was such a scene that several other soldiers on duty had gathered around to watch, too. Henderson smiled smugly. They won't last very long, he said arrogantly to the others. Back in the dome room, Richard was still comforting a saddened Gary while Pedro watched the other five in complete shock. Suddenly, he got very angry. So angry his face was turning scarlet from him seemingly holding his breath. Pedro inhaled deeply, and without warning, he screamed like an Indian warrior, so loudly that it caught everybody's attention and they froze hilariously. Carly and Christy were trying to choke each other. Richard and Frank, pinned to the ground, was attempting to punch him, and Joey looked like he was about to take a bite out of Richard's leg. Pedro? Richard began. You shut up, Pedro yelled, covering Richard's mouth with an outstretched hand. And you, and you, and you! He stretched himself even more and covered Carly, Christy, and Frank's mouth with his other hand and feet. Joey chuckled until Pedro stretched a shaking finger in front of his face. Reginald and Gary looked up, equally shocked. After a few moments of breathing heavily, Pedro found his voice again. Shame on you, he scolded to the others, brawling like a bunch of angry drunks. Jimmy is out there, probably fighting with security as we know it to release us. We're trapped in this godforsaken prison run by a psychotic nightmare, and all you can do is blame each other and beat each other up. Shame on you. Richard, Frank, Joey, Carly, and Christy all hung their heads and held their arms behind their backs, looking deeply ashamed. Seriously, Reginald added as he patted Gary on the back, I may not have known you wonderful people for very long, but these are not the people I remember when we first met. Your behavior is preposterous and utterly incorrigible. From what I have gathered in my studies, watching you all together, it seems James Reitherman has been the only one holding you all together, and this is the way you repay him? Yes, I admit it, he added more loudly, as the others showed every sign of interrupting. I laughed too, but that was because I couldn't help it. Seeing him covered in fruit triggered my funny bone. I can safely say, however, that I didn't resort to name-calling like little Miss Nordberg here. All James ever does is give, and you don't give him the time of day. Don't you see how selfish and neglectful you've all been? Reggie, said Frank timidly, we have been thinking about James. And yes, I admit it, even Carly, but we have our own lives, and it's quite a trip to come out and visit them, he sighed. I was very lucky to convince Glenn and Darrell to help out Donnie at the auto shop in my absence. And didn't you have to take time off from earning your teaching degree at USC? Inquired Christy. Indeed I did, nodded Reginald. But this was an emergency. What else could I say or do? I knew you would need all of us for this mission. Actually, aren't you and Richard still in school, Christiana? Richie and I are on spring break, so yes, we were able to come. I'm on spring break too, piped up Joey. And me, said Pedro. Pedro and Reggie are right, said Gary, wiping his eyes. We have been neglectful, especially to James. I don't even think some of us would even be friends had it not been for him, or the fact that all of us are friends with him. We've been nothing but a bunch of ungrateful jackasses. And now that I think of it, if it hadn't been for James and Carly's help, as well as their friends, I would still be the geeky narcissist I was before high school. You were no narcissist, Gary, said Carly reassuringly. And I'm sorry I accused you of being self-absorbed and uncaring. You actually are pretty cool deep down. And by the way, James and I loved all the food you sent us. It lasted us 10 days. Joey sniffled. Richie, Frankie, I'm sorry I ever... But his words were cut off by Frank and Richard hugging him. At that moment, everyone was apologizing to each other and hugging and making up. Within minutes, they were talking like they normally did once again. If only James were here, and I can tell him how much I love him, sighed Carly sadly. Everyone looked at her questioningly. But Carly, haven't you two been dating each other since you were in 8th grade? Christy asked. Yeah, sighed Carly happily. This was around the time he started to bulk up. After he was beaten up by those 4 nasty boys in 7th grade, his Uncle Henry and Aunt Betty began encouraging him to try out for more sports besides swimming, and to build up muscle so he can defend himself. What happened to him where he got beaten up? Reginald asked curiously. Everybody reacted in horror at this. Trust me, Reg, said Gary. You don't want to know. On a side note, if you're wondering what happened to James and how he became the muscular macho man he is today, I will tell you, but not right now. Not only is it too graphic to describe at the moment, but it will deviate from the focus of this story. You will find out more about his and Carly's childhood in the sequel story I'm still developing in my mind as we speak. Anyways, back to the story. But his aunt and uncle were very encouraging to him, said Carly reminiscing. I remember seeing him and our friends on the varsity baseball team. It was James, David Zimmerman, Kenneth O'Brien, and Vincent Dionisio. They were often compared to the 1927 Yankees, but the way they kept the home runs coming. Didn't Sharon Engelke and Barbara Ann McFlanagan always catch you spying on James working out at the gym? Gary asked, remembering. Hey, my friends knew about my crush on James, said Carly, smiling dreamily. In fact, everybody knew of it. The two of us were practically the most popular students in our year. And besides, how can any girl not deny a boy like James Matthew Reitherman? That smoking hot body, and a handsome face, big beautiful eyes, bulky muscles, very hairy, stinky, ticklish armpits, an impressive physique, but with a heart of gold underneath that very masculine exterior. It was enough to make any girl squeal with delight. Carly swooned and became so dizzy she nearly fainted, but luckily Richard and Christy managed to catch her in time. "Yes, Jimmy," she said dreamily, "I will become Mrs. Reitherman." Staring at Carly, Pedro whispered to something in Spanish to the intellectual Reginald, which translated to, "She is one sick puppy." Reginald nodded in agreement. Meanwhile, back in the security room, Henderson and the soldiers, who were apparently listening in on every single word, were shocked beyond belief. Henderson groaned disgustedly as he stared at the screens with deep disdain. Back in the dome room, the others were still staring at Carly in surprise as Richard and Christy revived her. "Well, if you're so certain he's the one," said Joey, "then why doesn't he just pop the question already?" "Joey," said Carly reproachfully, "we're not ready yet. He only turned 21 this February, and I'll be 21 in August. We haven't talked about marriage, and even if we did, we'd both wait a few more years." "I don't think Joey meant any disrespect," said Christy. "Knowing Joey," said Frank, "he never means any disrespect, even if what he says isn't entirely inappropriate." "He raises a good point, though," said Reginald thoughtfully. "You two are always dining together," said Joey. "Swimming together," said Frank. "Dancing together," said Pedro. "Playing together if you're not with your respective friends," said Gary. "Going on walks or exercising together," said Richard. "And ever since you two were 18, said Christy, "you spent any nights you two were by yourselves in your heated jacuzzi tub smoking large cigars together. Either that or going for a night swim in your backyard pool." Carly was blushing deeply. "I can't help it," she said at last. "Everything we do together, whether it be swimming, exercising, smoking cigars, or even just going on nature walks at camp, I always loved doing it with James. And I've only told him and our closest friends in high school, but I feel a hell of a lot safer when he's around, and he never hesitates to protect me." "That's very sweet," said Christy. "If you ever tell anybody at UCLA, I'm going to wring your neck like a chicken," Carly said sharply. "We won't tell," said Richard. The others agreed. For a few moments there was nothing but silence among them as they pondered what to do next, knowing full well that they